And that's the numbers of transgender prisoners in our prisons. Well, trans issues been in the news an awful lot lately, not least for the case of some trans prisoners, some prisoners born as men, committing crimes as men, being sentenced and jailed as men, but getting transferred over to female prisons and then using effectively their transgender persona. It's been said by a judge in the case of one, Karen White, born as Stephen Wood, to actually get in contact with vulnerable women behind bars. There have been a number of cases where a transgender inmate has sexually assaulted fellow prisoners after being transferred to a women's prison. But new official figures show that more than 100 male inmates in jails in England and Wales now identify as female. That's double the figure just 2 years ago. And the figure shows there are 139 transgender prisoners across 44 jails. And of the 42 in women's jails, 22 were men who identified as female, while in male prisons, 92 of the 97 were men also identifying as female. Let's talk about this with Richard GARSIDE. He's Director for the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. We understand that there are going to be people in this world, in this country, who are going to want to transition, and people are not at home with the identity they were born in biologically, and that's something I think the society is becoming more accepting of. But in recent months, there's been a lot of concern raised over whether or not the giving more rights to people who want to transition gender has actually opened the way for some people to take advantage of that, people to pretend they are transitioning in order to gain access to female victims. And this has been a particular concern about male prisoners transitioning to be females to then gain access to female-only prisons. 3,870 women right now in women's prisons. 1% of that women's prison population are now people who were born as men, which is rather alarming, do you not think?
Yeah, I mean, it's 1 in 200, so I guess that's about sort of 0.5%, but nonetheless, that works out at about 1 or 2 men in every women's prison. And, I mean, it's an advantage that we're having this conversation on radio rather than on Twitter, because it means I can kind of say things I'm not allowed to say on Twitter anymore, which is that trans women prisoners are men who identify as or claim to be women.
And the vast majority of those also, they transition during prison. They've not undergone any surgery. They are still intact.
No, well, exactly. And, whilst of course one needs to respect how people want to identify, and it's important that the prison service put in place arrangements to ensure that men who are identifying as or claiming to be women are in conditions where they feel safe and secure, that shouldn't be at the expense of of women in prison. And I think this is a real issue. I mean, just a couple of months ago, the then Prisons Minister Philip Lee told the House of Commons that he recognised that he had a responsibility for all women in prison. This is a difficult issue to manage, he said, but, quote, "I am persuaded that robust guidelines are in place so that nothing untoward would happen." Well, at the time that Philip Lee made that statement, Karen White had already been in a women's prison for a 3-month period and had abused at least 2 women whilst there.
Well, indeed, and that was within days of being in those prisons.
Well,
and this is the issue, isn't it? Is it we're told it's all safe, it's all safe. But, we can choose, for instance, when Topshop said, as they did earlier this year, that they're going to open their female-only changing rooms, and often bearing in mind a lot of the young girls often trying on clothes in those changing rooms to transgender women, i.e. to men, that we can choose not to go and shop in Topshop anymore. That's the truth. But we're talking about women who are very vulnerable behind bars, many of whom, it's very well logged now, the number of women who are behind bars who have actually experienced abuse in childhood or abuse from partners as part of their life experience, and they are therefore very vulnerable. For them to then suddenly be in an environment where they are being kept in cells alongside people who are biologically men is a very big risk.
Well, it is, and I think you point to a really important fact here that's often forgotten, which is that most women in prison have been victims of male violence, including male sexual violence, sometimes some quite grotesque male sexual violence. Women in prison have absolutely no agency or choice about being there or about who is there alongside it. As you said, it's not like the Topshop changing room where you can choose to take your customs somewhere else. And there is certainly an issue about men going into those prisons and actually abusing or physically abusing those women. But there is also a broader question here, which is about whether we believe it is possible or indeed necessary to have female-only spaces, and the degree, certainly within prisons, whether it's fair on women in prison who've experienced often some really grotesque male violence to be expected to share their spaces with other prisoners who they not unreasonably would consider to be men, and what that does for them, what that does for their rehabilitation or recovery, what that does for their general mental health. And this is something that, in my view, the government is just systematically ignoring. They have developed policies to support transgender prisoners, and that's very important, and I'm glad they're doing that. But they have to locate those policies within a broader framework of thinking what are the interests of women prisoners as a whole, and how can we best balance those interests against the interests of a relatively small but important segment of the prison population.
And in particular, I share your concern. Absolutely, I think there will be genuine cases of prisoners who actually, who do transition, are absolutely gender and are no threat whatsoever to anyone else, and certainly not to women in a women's jail. However, there is a lot of thought now, given the huge rise in numbers, that actually this is just being used as a cunning way for men either to gain access to vulnerable women by being moved to a women's prison, or also just simply to get to an easier prison regime for themselves, rather than serving time in a male jail where there may perhaps be a stricter, harsher regime. In which case, this is just being exploited. And people arguing about this debate is it's not transphobia. This is a genuine concern about the safety of other people, not just the trans prisoners.
No, quite so. And I mean, it's really important. And I mean, I'm glad you emphasise that clearly being a transgender person does not make you a danger to anybody. And it's really important to kind of emphasise that. But when it comes to prisons, the policies have to be built around not the person who's not going to abuse those policies, but built around those who are going to. And certainly in prisons, and there have been warnings now for a number of years that if the prison service is too permissive and too liberal and too relaxed in its policies around transgender prisoners, then those policies will be abused. And we've seen that in practice with Karen White. I think if the prison service don't rethink their current policies, there will be more Karen White. So I have very little doubt about that.
And my guess is actually that's just the one we've heard about as well. Richard GARSIDE, Director of the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Let me bring in my guest, Stephen Allen, Vanessa LLOYD PLATT. Vanessa, this argument about sort of women-only spaces, this sort of trans v women's rights. I never thought we'd get to this. I've always thought, I absolutely completely understand there are people who will transition, but we simply do have to allow for the fact there'll be people who will be using this as a way to abuse.
They are abusing the system, and we hear about this more and more often. And what people are now beginning to say is we seem to be bending over backwards to accommodate people in prison with whatever proclivities they might have. And I have no problem about people wanting to transition, but there is a real risk here, and the balance of risk is not being properly debated. It's not being properly looked at. And where are the human rights of those women in prison who have a right to be protected as well? And the balance is wrong.
Again, and the fact that these attacks for which this man has actually, he was a convicted double rapist, and he has actually been convicted again, sent back to a male prison, was when we were being told there were robust guidelines in place, Stephen.
I like the fact that this has been framed in, everyone is saying that they have respect for the trans community. So that, I think, is good and a great step forward.
It's terrible that it has to keep being said, though, isn't it?
It is, but the problem is if we then take the case of one person and have a rule that then impacts everyone in the trans community, that is also not fair. And it's
not just one person. I've got it's very simple for me. If you are, bearing in mind the time, children might still be on the way to school in the car. If you are physically intact as a man, biologically, you're not in a women's prison. End of. Nothing to discuss.
But also, if you are a woman in a woman's prison, you should be safe from being attacked by a cis or a trans woman. So actually, everyone should be safe in prison.
Can I just say, you're not allowed to come on my show and say a cis or a trans woman. A woman.
It just is
or
the
a
Latin
trans
opposite
woman.
of trans.
No. I'm not a cis woman. Vanessa is not a cis woman. We are women. We are biologically women. I am not going to have that BBC claptrap on my show.
I'm just using a bit just to differentiate.
I'm not going to have it. I'm a woman. I'm not a cis woman. I'm a woman. I was born a woman. 50% of this population are women. We're not cis women. We don't have to adjust what we're called for a tiny minority of activists who don't even represent trans people.
So if I said non-trans woman, would that be
That would be equally.
acceptable?
If you say that, I'm going to ask you to leave my studio. I'm absolutely serious. I'm not having it. I'm not having our language in this country traduced in this way. I'm a woman, you are a man. I'm quite happy for someone to be a trans woman or a trans man, but you don't take away what I am because you choose to change your gender.
No, but you get that. I was only using it in that sentence to point out the two groups.
No,
so in
the
general,
two groups
I refer to you as a woman
and trans woman.
Can I just take this debate on slightly to say that, talking about the way in which everyone's bending over backwards to accommodate people and criminals, we also have this story that's very worrying about the ex-wife fighting to stop a rapist seeing the children. And
yes,
we're
the Rotherham case.
all of these cases coming to the fore. Again, where is the balance?
We spent a lot of time talking about the rights of people which actually trample on other people's rights. We're going to have to leave this. Stephen and I are going to row about this during the break, I can assure you. 8:46 is the time. This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online.